Ikko makes some interesting and value-driven stuff. I'm a fan of their ITM03 and the ITM01 dongle DACs, for example. Unlike other hi-fi manufacturers, Ikko doesn't shove product after product into the market. They seem a bit more circumspect. They recently released their fourth IEM, the OH2. Hi-Fi Go asked if I wanted to review it, and of course, I said yes. Hi-Fi Go is among a few online resellers that specializes in hi-fi gear. You can find DACs, amps, IEMs, headphones, DAPs, cables, and all sorts of doodads on Hi-Fi Go's website. They have a great customer service and competitive pricing. If you're in the market for your next audiophile fix, stroll over to Hi-Fi Go and explore their product pages. The OH2 is $80. What does this newest entry offer the community? Ikko calls the OH2 dessert-level hi-fi. And who doesn't like dessert? It's the most important part of any meal. Ikko claims that the OH2 achieves the precise volume output of sound in a limited space, whatever that's supposed to mean. They say that the metal construction maximizes the volume, reflection, and diffusion angles. The OH2 is a single dynamic driver design. Unfortunately, Ikko does not say anything about the sound signature. They don't even waste time using flowery language to muddle the information. Hi-Fi Go does have a press release about the OH2. There, Hi-Fi Go says that the OH2 has a warm, neutral sound tuning. The back of the box has a frequency response graph indicating a treble emphasis. Some contradictory information. The OH2 has an interesting and somewhat unique design. It is wedge-shaped. The majority of the housing is metal, while there's a small section with see-through plastic, letting you observe some of the components. The IEM has a flat shape. The ear tip nozzle has a sharp angle. The OH2 feels a little bit heavy. It's about as hefty as the Moondrop Aria. Ikko supplies a plethora of accessories. You get 9 pairs of various ear tips, some which have a wide, flat design while others are more traditional. You also get an MMCX cable. This cable feels soft, looks good, and transmits little microphonics. The box contains a leather carrying bag, the standard Ikko lapel pin, and a magnet decal just for fun. All of these accessories are well made. As for comfort, I found the OH2 to be fairly comfortable. This IEM sits flush within my ears. Because of the various shapes of the supplied ear tips, it took a bit of experimentation, but I found a set that was a good balance of comfort and isolation. I could easily wear the OH2 for about 3 hours before needing a break. Overall, the OH2 is a very well-crafted IEM. It's sturdy, and I found it to be comfortable. The OH2 comes with a wide selection of accessories, and in stark contrast to the $700 Death on Ray Tender, this $80 product just kills it in the accessory, fit, and build category. To test the OH2, I used it with my RME 80i2 DAC, the Ikko Zerta ITM03, Low 2 PAW S1, and the Low 2 PAW 6000. I used the stock accessories. I primarily use the medium cone-shaped ear tips. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD and Qobuz. The OH2 is not difficult to drive. On the Zerta, for example, I rarely had to go above 10% volume and never came close to 50%. The OH2 appears to have a fairly neutral sub-bass and slightly elevated mid-bass. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a rumble at the beginning. This builds into a crescendo. The OH2 clearly presented this detail from beginning to end. It was similar to what I heard on the Neutral Moondrop Quarks. When the crescendo hit, the organ was easily audible among the mix, though all elements did meld. The rolling thunder effect was patently obvious. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were one step ahead of the instruments. In Conquered by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This is supposed to pan from right to left to center. The OH2 clearly presented this detail. There are multiple drums in this track, and the OH2 rendered all of them. Each drum strike was hard, a little bit harder than what I heard on the Quarks. There was minimal melding from one drum strike to the next. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the sub-bass was easily audible. The subwoofer sounded like it was at the other end of a medium-sized room. Drums were louder by a few decibels. Vocals were separate from instruments and retained their sparkle. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I use these songs to listen for any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volume, I could not hear any distortion. Overall, the OH2 appears to have neutral or close to neutral sub-bass. Mid-bass seems to be a little elevated. There is about average clarity in the mids region. The OH2 seems to have neutral mids. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grain and sibilants mixed in. The OH2 presented both details without accentuating either. This presentation was similar to what I heard on the neutral Moondrop Quarks. Orla's voice was one step ahead of the instruments. There was some melding between the drums and guitar. In Want You Back by Haim, the OH2 presented the sibilants in the primary female artist. However, this was not accentuated and sounded similar to what I heard on the Quarks. At 8 seconds, the singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The OH2 rendered this detail clearly. There are 2 backup vocalists, one in either channel. The OH2 presented both voices separately. When the instruments played at maximum, I could just barely hear all 3 vocalists with their individual tonalities. The drums did not overwhelm the other instruments. However, there was some melding among the drums, piano, guitar, and bass. The vocals stood 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the OH2 presented the ukulele, drums, and bass clearly. No single instrument overpowered any other. The primary male vocalist sibilance was not accentuated. This was similar to what I heard on the Quarks. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most IEMs and headphones cannot reveal this subtle detail. The OH2 could not either. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The OH2 rendered this detail. Overall, the OH2 appears to have neutral mids. Vocals are clear and separate from instruments. Sibilance and vocal grain is presented if recorded into the track, but neither is emphasized. The OH2 seems to have very close to neutral treble presentation, with perhaps a slight emphasis in the mid to upper treble region. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the OH2 presented the brass and horns clearly. Their nasally signatures came through the other instruments. The higher pitched notes sounded similar to what I heard on the Quarks. However, it seemed that the OH2 was adding just a hint of additional energy in the mid or upper treble area. The difference was not significant. I could hear the various group sets without difficulty. The timpani was audible but did not get louder than the other instruments. The OH2 has depth and width but no verticality. In other words, I could hear instruments closer or further into the wings, and some sounded like they were layered as if in an orchestra arrangement. However, no sounds came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the OH2 made the piano sound like it was about 5 feet away. The bassy notes were not distorted, but there was some melding from one note to the next. The cello was equally as loud as the piano, and the 2 instruments melded slightly with each other. I easily heard the pops and sizzles and the electric buzzing effects. I also heard the creaking of wood on the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello's weight. However, both details were a little bit muffled. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the OH2 presented the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and the bass 1 step behind. I could easily concentrate on one instrument or another. The saxophone sounded similar to what I heard on the Quarks, except that it was just a little bit clearer on the OH2. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in slightly varying tonalities. The OH2 made the cymbal strikes sound the same. Overall, the OH2 has close to neutral treble. There seems to be a slight emphasis in the mid to upper treble region, but this is far from harsh or piercing. Ikko does not say what the OH2's detail retrieval should be. My tests indicate that this IEM has about average detail retrieval. Obvious details will be hard to miss, and even some subtle details might be audible. However, nuanced or layered details might not jump out or be missing altogether. The creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, pops and sizzles, multiple vocalists, sharp intakes of breaths, twangs of guitar strings, gravelly natures of voices, these types of details will appear on the OH2. I have a quantitative test for detail retrieval. I use Kazuki's song New Light, which has layers of details. This includes the sound of wind, rustling of grass, children playing, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Heidi's MS2 presents 8 to 9 footsteps. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and the T2 Evo present 7 to 8. The Moondrop Aria presents 7 footsteps. The T2 Plus, Blonde BL05, the Audio Legacy 2 all present 6 to 7 footsteps. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6 footsteps. The Moondrop Quarks, Blonde BL03, and Triple Wind Melee each presents 5 to 6 footsteps. The Ikko OH2 presented 6 to 7 footsteps. For my detail resolution scale, I use the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Any IEM that provides more or less footsteps is judged accordingly. Thus, on my scale, the BL03 would be considered below average and the T2 would be above average. Using this standard, it seems clear to me that the OH2 has average amount of detail. You might get a little bit more if you use different ear tips than what I had. Ikko does not tell us what the soundstage of the OH2 should be. Your perception of soundstage will depend on the ear tips you use, how deeply you insert the IEMs, and the music you listen to. My experience with the OH2 indicates that this IEM has about average soundstage. There is some width and depth, but no verticality. Vocals are clear and nothing sounds distorted or muddy or veiled. Just as with the detail resolution test, I also have a scale for soundstage. For me, this involves, yet again, using the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Anything that has greater or lesser soundstage is judged accordingly. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 has above average soundstage. The Heidi's MS2 is similar to the T2 in this regard. The Blonde BL03 and the BL05S are average at best and perhaps slightly below average in soundstage based on proper fit. The Starfield, Aria, and Quarks are average. I would place the OH2 on the same stage as the Aria and the Quarks. I wish companies would just tell us what their products sound like. If they did, we might have less confusion. Unfortunately, Ikko does not say. HiFiCo's website says that this IEM has neutral warm sound signature. In my mind, warm sounding means elevated bass and recessed mids. Vocalists and instruments are close to the ears or intimate. Neutral to me means the product does not emphasize or de-emphasize any aspect of the music. My go-to neutral IEMs and headphones are the Allo S4X, Avantone Planar HD6XX, and the Moondrop Quarks. The OH2 has a fairly neutral sub-bass with a slight emphasis in mid-bass. The emphasis is not boomy and does not overwhelm other elements in the mix. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is about average. The OH2 has neutral mids. Vocals stand 1 to 2 steps ahead of instruments. Vocal grain and sibilance, if recorded into the track, are presented, but neither is emphasized. There is little bass bleed into the mids. The treble seems to be close to neutral, with a slight elevation in the mid to upper treble region. Treble instruments never sound harsh or piercing and are typically clear. The OH2 has average detail retrieval and soundstage. Is the OH2 warm sounding? I don't think so. My definition of warm sounding does not seem to apply here. Is the OH2 neutral? Technically no, but it's darn close. The slight mid-bass and mid-treble emphasis is not significant at all. I suspect that if you wanted to EQ a flatter target, you might be able to do it on this IEM. There is nothing offensive about the OH2's performance. This is clearly not a bass head IEM or one that exaggerates treble. Some people want that type of excitement. If that's you, then the OH2 might not be for you. However, if you want a closer to neutral rendition, then I think the OH2 might fit that category. We should conduct comparisons of products. That's the only way to know if the newest gear is actually different. Here, we will compare the OH2 against the Ikko OH1 and the Moondrop Aria. I used the stock accessories. I plugged each IEM into a passive AB switch. That switch was plugged into my Army 80i2 DAC. I tried to volume match. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD and Qobuz. The OH1 seems to have greater sub-bass presence than the OH2. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass was more obvious on the OH2. Bass transience was identical. Mid-bass impact was a little bit harder on the OH1 with sharper drum hits. The mids were also different. The OH2 has a neutral rendition of vocal grain and sibilance. The OH1 has a marginal emphasis of both details. Vocals are 1 to 2 steps ahead of instruments on the OH2, but seem about shoulder to shoulder to instruments on the OH1. Separation of mid-centric elements is marginally clearer on the OH2. There's a bit more bass bleed into the mids on the OH1. The treble is not the same. The OH1 has an upper treble emphasis, while the OH2 has a slight emphasis in comparison. Going back and forth, the OH2 seemed to present instruments a little further away from the ears with a bit more clarity. The OH1 has about the same amount and type of detail retrieval as the OH2. However, the OH2 has slightly wider soundstage. The aria has a greater emphasis in sub-bass than the OH2. Both IEMs seem to present similar mid-bass. However, separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is clearer on the OH2. Transience is a little faster on the OH2. Mid-bass impact is possibly a little harder on the aria. The mids are different as well. The aria has recessed mids while the OH2 appears to have a more neutral tuning. The aria places vocals one step behind instruments with drums sounding louder. The OH2 presents vocals a step ahead of instruments. The aria emphasizes vocal sibilance. Separation and clarity is fairly similar between the two. The treble is similar. Both IEMs seem to accentuate mid-treble. Separation and clarity in this region is a little bit more obvious on the OH2. The OH2 and aria present similar detail retrieval, but the OH2 has slightly wider soundstage. Comparisons like these help us understand where new products fit into the ever-expanding universe of IEMs. Here, it is clear that the OH2 is not a rehashed OH1, and that the OH2 is not an aria clone. Instead, all three products have their distinct sound signatures. While they might share some commonalities, they do not sound identical. Whether you will enjoy any of these products is something for you to decide. You cannot go 1 month without running into a handful of new IEMs. It's remarkable how quickly companies produce these things. It's like there's a magic spring that IEM companies are harvesting. There are IEMs of every shape, size, sound, and price tag. If you want to overpay, you're covered. You stroll over to the $3,000 IEM market. If you want to add bling to your gear, how about a flashy cable? Why not buy any one of a multitude of ear tips? This is an amazing ecosystem that shows no signs of stopping. It will expand until we are all consumed. But it is nice to see that people are getting plenty of options to choose from. Depending on your financial status, you can easily and happily live in the sub-$100 IEM market and probably find every type of sound signature, physical design, and fit there is to be had. The Ikko OH2, in my view, is a unique product that flows into this incredibly crowded space. Ikko does not relentlessly shove gear at us. They seem to take their time to develop, which is a benefit to everybody. The OH2 has a very sturdy build, and one that I think is particular to it. I can't recall seeing another IEM designed to look as the OH2 does. This product, I think, is easy to wear. It is very well accessorized. The sound signature is neutral-ish. The OH2 does not bloat meze, does not create harsh or sharp vocals, and does not present piercing treble. This brings us to value. Yes, the OH2 is value at $80. This is the same price category as the aria, which is another IEM I believe is clearly value. While many other manufacturers are creating aggressively V or W-shaped sound signatures, it's nice to see that Ikko has opted for a more neutral, less heavy-handed approach. As I look at the OH2, I see a product that is well-crafted and perfectly agreeable. While plenty of people will find this IEM not to their taste, there will be many others who will likely enjoy what the OH2 has to offer. I cannot predict what your experience will be, but I can say that if you've got the aria, one of the blondes, the melee, the tin hi-fi T2, or the OH1, then the OH2 will indeed present a noticeably different sound signature. Taken in totality, the OH2 is a good product worth considering.